No one ever expected a legend to leave the world in such a hushed, ordinary way. It was August 1990, inside a quiet hotel room in Philadelphia. Pearl Bailey, the woman who had once set Broadway ablaze and charmed presidents, was resting. She had come to the city for a knee replacement surgery, a routine, simple procedure that doctors had declared perfect. She was in high spirits, even joking that she would be back on stage by the fall. As the late summer sun began to set, casting a yellow glow through the half-drawn curtains, her husband, the legendary drummer Lou Belson, sat nearby in an armchair, casually flipping through a music magazine. The room was peaceful, but in that silence, unannounced and without a single cry of pain, Pearl Bailey's heart simply stopped. There were no final words. No dramatic farewells. The woman known to the world as America's ambassador of love slipped away so quietly that the person who loved her most didn't even realize she was gone until it was too late. This sudden silence was a jarring contrast to a life that had been loud, vibrant, and relentlessly public. But to understand why her death shook America so deeply, we must look past the smiling photos and the Tony Awards. We must uncover the life of contradictions, the scars of domestic violence, and the racial trauma that she hid behind that famous smile until her very last breath. The tragedy of Pearl Bailey's life began before she even took her first breath. Born in 1,918 inches, the port town of Newport News, Virginia, she entered a family that didn't want a daughter. Her father, a Pentecostal minister, and her mother had been expecting a boy. They had already chosen the name Dick. When Pearl arrived, their disappointment manifested in a cruel nickname that stuck with her throughout her childhood, Dickie. It was a half-joke, half-judgment that acted like a curse, instilling in her a lifelong feeling that she was a mistake, that she had to constantly prove her worth to exist. At age 4, the family moved to Washington, D.C. It was here, in her father's church, that Pearl learned her first lesson about the economics of emotion. She watched as the congregation sang, clapped, and wept. She noticed that when the singing grew intense, the emotions didn't just bring faith, they brought money. Bills floated into the collection plates. Little Pearl realized then that music was not just a language of survival, it was a tool that could open wallets. But behind the holy facade of the church, her home life was a war zone. Her parents' marriage crumbled into violent arguments, often erupting right after Sunday service. Eventually, her mother fled to Philadelphia with the children, hoping for a better life. But the city of brotherly love offered only cold reality. Her mother remarried, but the stepfather couldn't hold a job. The burden of survival fell on Pearl. At just 15, she dropped out of school. She didn't step onto a stage. She stepped onto her knees to scrub floors as a maid for wealthy white families. She cleaned their toilets and washed their clothes, entering their glowing mansions only through the back door. But every night, staring at her raw, bruised hands, Pearl repeated a mantra that would define her destiny. I was not born to bow to anyone. Salvation seemed to arrive in the form of her brother, Willie, a tap dancer who returned home with tales of the theater. He convinced Pearl to enter an amateur talent contest at the Pearl Theater. She chose to sing Poor Butterfly, a melancholy ballad about waiting and loss. When she opened her mouth, the rowdy crowd fell dead silent. They didn't clap because she was technically perfect. They clapped because her voice carried a haunting, tangible pain. She won the contest. For a fleeting moment, she believed she had crossed the line from poverty to stardom. But the world was quick to teach her a brutal lesson. 2 weeks later, the theater owner went bankrupt and vanished, taking all the performers' pay with him. Pearl was left standing on a curb, penniless and confused. She realized then that the stage could shine like gold, but it could be as cold as steel. Yet, she refused to go back to scrubbing floors. She sang in smoky bars and nightclubs, enduring the grind, until she finally reached the legendary Apollo Theater in Harlem. That night, the applause confirmed she was an artist. But she didn't know that fame would bring nightmares far worse than poverty. In the 1,940 seconds, Pearl entered what was known as the coal circuit, a string of rough venues in mining towns where the pay was low, the liquor was cheap, and the audiences were dangerous. She performed on rickety stages, dodging flying bottles from drunk patrons. It was during these lonely years that she sought safety in love, only to find violence. In 1942, she married a drummer, desperate for protection. But the man who seemed gentle on stage turned into a monster behind closed doors. Jealousy and alcohol fueled his rage. After 18 months of beatings, Pearl fled, bruised but alive. When World War II broke out, she joined the USO to sing for the troops. She was a goddess on stage, but once the show ended, she was forced to sleep in storage rooms or colored-only hotels. During the war, she met her second husband, a quiet soldier. They married quickly, but peace brought its own war. He returned from the front lines with his mind shattered by PTSD. He withdrew into silence and anger, eventually leaving her a note that read, "I'm not the man you married." The marriage lasted less than 6 months. The defining moment of her resilience came one night in New Jersey. After attending a Frank Sinatra concert, Pearl was attacked by 2 strangers solely because of the color of her skin. They beat her in the street. She didn't fight back. She didn't scream. She simply stood up, wiped the blood from her busted lip, and walked away. The next morning, she was back on stage, singing through the pain. Pearl had learned that in a world that wanted to break her, silence and survival were the ultimate forms of resistance. In 1944, Pearl arrived in New York City. Her unique style, half singing, half talking, full of weary wisdom, captivated the elite. She signed with Columbia Records and debuted on Broadway. But even at the top, she fought for her dignity. White directors demanded she speak in a stereotypical dialect, using dems and dos to make white audiences laugh. Pearl refused flatly. "We don't talk like that anymore." "No one does," she told them. The script was rewritten. But her personal life remained a tragedy. In 1948, she married for the 3rd time. John Randolph Pinkett was educated and charming, promising her a refined life. But he was a controlling alcoholic, far more dangerous than her previous partners. The horror peaked in 1952. During a jealous rage, Pinkett didn't just hit her with his fist. He took a heavy pistol and struck Pearl directly on the head. The blow was so violent it cracked her skull. Blood poured down her collar. She survived, but something inside her died that night. The belief that love could save her. She filed for divorce, taking nothing but her voice. Weeks later, she was back under the spotlight, smiling at the audience while concealing a healing fracture beneath her wig. By the end of 1952, Pearl Bailey had given up on love, but destiny had one more card to play. She met Lou Belson, the white drummer for Duke Ellington's band. He was 6 years younger, gentle, and saw her not as a black star, but as a woman. They fell in love to the rhythm of the drums. However, America in the 1,950 seconds was not ready for a high-profile interracial marriage. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Lou's father wrote a desperate letter begging him to call off the wedding, saying he didn't want mixed-race grandchildren. Lou read the letter, folded it, and never replied. They married in secret in London to avoid the press. Returning to America, they faced a storm. Hotels turned them away. Audiences walked out when they saw a white man playing drums for a black woman. But they stood their ground for nearly 40 years. Lou Belson famously said, "I never played behind her, I played with her." He became her anchor, the only man who didn't try to break her. Professionally, Pearl reached the stratosphere in 1967 when she led an all-black cast in Hello, Dolly on Broadway. She transformed the role, winning a Tony Award and becoming a national icon. President Nixon named her the Ambassador of Love. She was the face of unity in a divided nation. But while she healed the nation's spirit, her own body was failing. The stress of decades of touring and trauma began to take its toll. In 1965, she collapsed from heart failure. In 1974, while in Denver, the thin mountain air caused her heart to stop completely for several seconds. She was resuscitated, clawing her way back from death. Doctors begged her to retire. She refused. "If I stop singing, I'll stop breathing," she declared. She continued to perform, but she switched to smaller venues, joking that she sang just enough so her heart wouldn't complain. In the 1,980 seconds, facing her mortality, Pearl did something extraordinary. After a second major heart attack, she didn't retreat. She sought answers. In 1985, at the age of 67, the legendary Pearl Bailey enrolled as a freshman at Georgetown University to study theology. She sat in lecture halls with students young enough to be her grandchildren. She refused special treatment, wrote her own papers, and studied the Bible not to find God in heaven, but to understand why her heart was still beating on earth. When she graduated, she made the dean's list. Her philosophy was simple: faith isn't waiting, it's walking. She spent her final years working with Barbara Bush on literacy campaigns, using her fame to help others read. She kept moving, kept working, until that fateful trip to Philadelphia in August 1990. She went in for the knee surgery, optimistic as ever. But her tired heart, which had endured abuse, racism, and exhaustion, finally decided it was time to rest. The aftermath of her death was a quiet tragedy for those she left behind. Lou Belson, the man who had drummed by her side for 4 decades, was shattered. He told reporters, "I lost my best friend, and never remarried, living 19 more years with her memory." The tragedy deepened years later when their 2 adopted children, Tony and Dee Dee, died within 5 months of each other in 2004, extinguishing the immediate Belson-Bailey line. Pearl Bailey's life was not a fairy tale, it was a battle. She was a woman who survived 3 disastrous marriages, a cracked skull, the humiliation of segregation, and a heart that tried to stop multiple times before the end. She was not a political activist who marched in the streets. She was a revolutionary of dignity. She forced America to respect her not by shouting, but by standing still in the spotlight, refusing to bow, and singing the truth. In the end, Pearl Bailey proved that the brightest lights often burn from the fuel of the deepest darkness. She didn't just entertain the world, she showed it how to survive. As she once whispered to the world, "Don't wait for the world to change. Sing and make it listen."